Good morning. I'll be reading from 1 Samuel 18, 1 through 5. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off his robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow and his belt. Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well.
It is great to see everyone this morning, and let me call your attention to a couple of housekeeping things before we get into the lesson this morning. One of which has to do with a web ministry survey that you'll find scattered in the backs of the pews in front of you. If you would please fill those out. We appreciate those who work with this ministry very much. If you would fill these out and put them in a box that is just outside these doors to this side of the information center outside, we would appreciate your input on this very much as plans are made for updating the website and adding some new features, and we would love to hear from you on that. Also, you may have been seeing in the bulletin that we're going to have a blood drive next Sunday, and the hours of that are listed in the bulletin. It basically starts right after we're dismissed and I think goes through about 2:30. But we are still in need of many to sign up for that. Robert, could you turn this back just a tad? Thank you, brother. There are so many in our community who receive transfusions on a daily basis. Some of these are our loved ones. Some of these are our friends. And while we gather in settings like this to worship and think about the blood of Christ that was given for our spiritual life, the physical blood that we donate very much blesses and extends physical life. And so if this is something that you can participate in, we would appreciate you doing that very much. And there is a sign-up list in the foyer for that. Normally this would be a life group Sunday, and we would be having life group meetings this afternoon and this evening scattered around various places. But because of our awesome April Sunday nights that are going on, we have pushed the pause button on regular life group meetings and are encouraging all who are involved in the life group ministry to be here this evening along with the rest of the congregation for this series of special classes that we're having. They are listed, those 5 individual classes are listed on the front of your bulletin, and just select the one that is most needful for you right now. Maybe the one that is most needful for you right now is the same one you attended last week. Go again. You know, if it did you that much good and you feel you need a little more, just go back and soak in some more. You won't be kicked out if you've been to that class before. But our desire is that as many of us as possible would rotate through these classes. And again, it doesn't matter how many you may have missed before. They are standalone lessons, even though they're taken from this same book. So we hope to see all of you back at 5 o'clock this evening. Also, life group leaders, co-leaders, remember to plan something additional this month with your group, social activity, service activity, something of that nature. But even though we're not having the life group meetings today, and even though I didn't have to put together a life group discussion guide this week, I decided to go ahead and stick with the Cloud of Witnesses theme that we've been doing on Life Group Sundays. And the rationale for this series comes from the first 2 verses of Hebrews chapter 12, following on Hebrews chapter 11, which has talked about these great men and women of faith in the past who have lived for God, who have overcome adversity, who have found victory in their lives through faith in God. Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 says, "Therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin that so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith." And as we were preparing for this series, I asked you to tell me who you would like to focus on in this series. Not just people from Hebrews chapter 11, maybe other people from the Old Testament that aren't mentioned in that chapter. Maybe people that we read about in the New Testament that encourage you, that inspire you, that challenge you to live more closely with the will of God and following in the steps of Jesus. And so a couple of months ago, we talked about Rahab, this woman, a Canaanite woman, a prostitute who is transformed from a harlot into a heroine among God's people and is assimilated into God's people. She chose faith in Israel's God over the gods of her own people. Then we toggled to the New Testament last month, and we talked about Barnabas, E.I. Joe, this guy who has an eye for encouragement. He's constantly encouraging other people. Today we go back to the Old Testament and really talk about a guy who centuries earlier, when you think about Barnabas, this is really a brother from another mother. A guy who has the same kind of heart, the same kind of attitude, even though he lived centuries before Barnabas did. So we're talking about Jonathan today, the eldest son of Saul. And historically speaking, we're going back to about 1,050 years before Christ, a little over 3,000 years ago. And it's still going to be amazing and remarkable and astounding how much human nature hasn't changed in the last 3,000 years. Saul is selected by God. He is God's anointed to be Israel's first king, even though he didn't bring up having a king. It is the desire of the people. God acquiesced. He tells Samuel, listen, they haven't rejected you as leader of the people. They have rejected me. But acquiesce to their wishes and anoint Saul, the son of Kish, as the king of my people. And it doesn't take Saul very long at all to go from humility to arrogance. In the beginning, he is so bashful that at his coronation, he doesn't even want to show up. He doesn't want to be seen. He hides himself. And he has to be dragged out in front of the people. And he goes from that level of bashfulness to such haughtiness and pride in seeking his own will above and beyond the will of God. And so by the time we first find Jonathan mentioned in 1 Samuel 13, Saul has already been told by Samuel that God's done with him pretty much. That because of his pride, because of his disobedience, God has rejected him. The kingdom's going to be taken away from him. There is going to be no dynasty that is going to follow in the family of Saul. And he has sought out a man after his own heart, yet unnamed. We're not going to be introduced to him until a few more chapters. And though this will ultimately prove to be David, the son of Jesse of Bethlehem, Saul's son Jonathan certainly has the kind of heart that God would have delighted in. The kind of person in whom God would have been extremely pleased. Jonathan is the oldest of Saul's three sons. If you read 1 Samuel chapter 14, if you go to 1 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 33, you find a fourth son, Eshbaal, mentioned. And it's possible that Eshbaal was born later in Saul's life. He's certainly not among the three sons that die with Saul on Mount Gilboa. But at least three sons, possibly four sons, two daughters, Merib and Michal, are born to Saul by his wife Ahinoam. And this is kind of a one-off deal in a good way, because this seems to be a nuclear family, which is unusual among kings. There's not multiple wives. There's not concubines. There's mom, there's dad, there's 5 kids or 6 kids, depending on which genealogy you read. We don't know exactly what Jonathan looked like, even though we know what his dad looked like. Chapter 9, verse 2 of 1 Samuel tells us that Saul was tall and handsome, and we assume rather dark, being of the Middle East. So he's tall, dark, and handsome, and maybe Jonathan, the oldest son, kind of favors his dad. Maybe he's tall, dark, and handsome as well. And at this point in Israel's history, we just sort of have a kingdom in the making. This is just getting off the ground. This isn't the kingdom that Solomon's going to reign over a couple of generations later. Saul could have well used a volume called Kingdoms for Dummies, because he hasn't done this before. He didn't come up through leadership training, and he wasn't groomed in a royal court. This is all new to him. He's only got an army of 600 men, over which he and his son Jonathan serve as the leaders. And they're very much under the will and the sway of their Philistine overlords. These Philistines have so much influence that they've even made sure that there aren't any blacksmiths or iron workers among the Israelites that could fashion weapons of war that could be used against them. And so the Philistines handle all the sharpening that needs to be done. The Israelites have to go and pay the Philistines to have their farm implements sharpened. Their mattocks and their axes and their hoes and their pitchforks. They have to rely on the Philistines. In fact, we're told at the end of chapter 13 that among all of Saul's men, no one had a sword except Saul and Jonathan. 2 swords in a 600-man army. And then you got axes and pitchforks and all these other farm implements. Not exactly the makings of a great kingdom at this point. But we immediately see in Jonathan faith and bravery and skill as a warrior, and confidence in the Lord God of Israel. And he doesn't presumptively assume that just because he has faith in God, that God's going to bless everything that he does. If you kind of want to work with me, I apologize for not having a PowerPoint this morning. I'm PowerPointless this day. And so we're just going to have to actually look in our Bibles for some of these scriptures. Remember that? So turn some pages or scroll through your electronic doohickey there. And we will get to 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 6. The situation here is that Jonathan decides to take action. My father is the king. We're living in fear. Somebody needs to do something. And so Jonathan and his armor bearer sneak away. He doesn't tell his father, doesn't ask permission. He just takes his armor bearer and they go against this Philistine garrison. That's at the top of a very steep place. They have to crawl up on their hands and knees. And in 1 Samuel 14:6, Jonathan says to his armor bearer, "Come and let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us, for the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few." Notice he doesn't say that the Lord won't save by many. He just says he's not restrained to do either one. He can do it either way he wants to. If he wants to win the battle with many soldiers, he'll do it. If he wants to win the battle with a few, he'll do it. It's not up to man, it's up to God. As his dear friend David will say, the battle is the Lord's. And maybe Jonathan grew up hearing some of those great stories of events that had happened earlier. Remember, the events of the book of Judges aren't far removed historically from Jonathan's lifetime. That's fairly recent history. And maybe he's heard about Gideon and how through the direction of God, Gideon's army is reduced from 32,000 down to 10,000, down to 300 to face 135,000 Midianites. And maybe Jonathan's thinking if he's done it once, he can do it twice. And maybe he can do it through 2. And so Jonathan takes the battle to the Philistines. And in the first attack, he kills 20 Philistine warriors. And the earth quakes, I'm assuming because God makes it quake. And because the earth is quaking, the Philistines start quaking. And Saul finally gets on board. He perceives what's happening in the distance. And he rallies his troops. 1 Samuel 14:23 says that the Lord delivered Israel that day. And he did. It was the Lord's doing. But I want you to notice that Jonathan was the catalyst. He was the spark that inspired others to fight. He is the one with the bravery, with the faith, with the trust in God. And his father Saul, very foolishly and selfishly, had forbidden anyone to eat that day, promised a curse upon anyone who did eat that day. Don't eat until I have avenged myself against my enemies. Nobody eats until I have avenged myself upon my enemies. Got an ego problem there, Saul? Just a little. Just a little. Jonathan doesn't hear what his dad says because he's out at the front lines. He's leading the charge. And being weary later in the day, in the forest, he comes across some wild honey, dips the tip of his staff in it. He eats it. He's immediately refreshed. His eyes brighten. He's good to go from then on. Saul can't figure out why the Lord won't answer him that day. He assumes that somebody has violated the ban, and he says, whoever's done that is going to die, even if it's my son Jonathan. And he didn't know how prophetic his words were. And he's ready to kill his son. That's how egotistical, that's how foolish, that's how self-centered he was, that he would kill this brave, faithful, champion son of his just to fulfill his foolish vow. And at this point, the people come to Jonathan's defense. This is in verse 45 of 1 Samuel 14. But the people said to Saul, must Jonathan die who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. So the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. I want you to consider what the people are willing to risk. And I want you to consider why they must have been willing to risk it. They know what a hothead Saul is. They know how rash and violent and impulsive he can be. And they put their necks on the line. They put their lives at risk for Jonathan, I think only because of the love and respect and admiration that they felt for him. The kind of character that they perceived in him, the kind of faith that they had seen exemplified by him. And if it means that they die, they're going to defy their king and say, this man will not die today. That has got to tell us something wonderful about Jonathan's character. One of the most focused upon chapters in 1 Samuel is chapter 17 because of the battle of David and Goliath. And because of the text that Mike read for us a few moments ago from the first 5 verses of chapter 18, I think we can safely assume because of that Jonathan is present throughout chapter 17. That he is there with Saul and David's 3 older brothers and the army of Israel at the valley of Elah between Soko and Azekah. He has been there for 40 days while Goliath comes out twice a day and taunts the army of Israel and mocks their God. And nobody makes a move. Not Saul, not even Jonathan. And so I believe Jonathan was there and watches in amazement as the younger brother of 3 of these soldiers, David from Bethlehem, takes the battle to the giant. And he watches as he selects just one of these 5 smooth stones. He slings it, he sinks it in the giant's forehead, he falls. David takes Goliath's sword, cuts his head off, and this inspires the army. And I'm assuming Jonathan participates then in the routing of the Philistine army. And he's there when David returns to the presence of Saul. And that's what is described here in the first 4 verses in particular of chapter 18 is Jonathan's response to what he has just seen in David. It says that Jonathan loved David as himself, that from that moment on his soul was knit to the soul of David. He made a covenant with David, and then get this, he gives him his robe. Not just any old garment, not just something hanging in the closet. This is the robe of the heir apparent from a human standpoint. The robe of the crown prince he gives to David. He gives him his sword. Maybe they've confiscated some of the Philistine swords by now, but for a while that was 50% of the swords in the army. And he gives his to David, and he gives him his armor, and he gives him his bow, and he gives him his belt. And we see in Jonathan such great humility. We see in him this great lack of jealousy, so unlike his father. Thankfully, this apple fell a long way from the tree. And he doesn't have the mindset and the attitude and the character of his father. It's tough to do what Jonathan does for any of us. How do you feel when someone else is honored? Does it ever bother you when something good happens to someone else? Particularly if you think you were more deserving of that good thing than they were? As I was preparing for this lesson, I hadn't thought about this in years, but I thought of my 10th grade year at Marshall County High School in Lewisburg, Tennessee. I had had mono during the fall semester and missed basketball season, which was really frustrating. But I recovered over Christmas break and was ready for tennis season in the spring. And we had had a good season. For most of the season, I played the number 2 spot for about 4 or 5 matches during the regular season. I played the number 1 spot. Kenneth, George, and I would switch off. We were doubles partners, and regionals were coming up. And we had a team meeting before first period, the Friday before regionals were going to start the next Monday. And our coach said, we had 10 members on the team, and only 6 could go to regionals. There would be 6 singles matches, 3 doubles matches. And rather than using his position and authority as the coach and based on his knowledge of the team, rather than saying, these are the 6 that are going and these are the 4 that are not, he said, well, Kenneth is going to go for sure because he's a senior. This is his last year. I was a sophomore. Kenneth was a senior, so he's going for sure. The other 5 positions will be selected by drawing names from a hat. And I thought, well, I've got 5 chances out of 9 of being drawn from the hat. That's pretty good. First name, second name, third name, fourth name, fifth name. My name's not drawn. I'm not going to regionals. I wasn't very happy for the people who were. I wasn't excited for them. I was just thinking about me. And I thought about me for the rest of that meeting. Don't remember another word the coach said. I kept thinking about me as I walked down the hall into my French room, as I was walking down the row, and I came to an empty desk in the front row, and I kicked it as hard as I could. Caught it right under the writing area, totally flipped it. And that just made things worse because the teacher was already in the room. I did not handle that very graciously. I did not handle that very humbly. I did not handle that the way I hope I would handle that today. I hope I've matured a lot since then. I wasn't very mature at that point. 1 Corinthians 12:26 says of the body of Christ, if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. If one member is honored, all the members rejoice. Jonathan was rejoicing with David. There's no jealousy over his defeat of Goliath. There's no saying, well, you know, that really should have been me out there. They should be singing about me. You know the song that they're singing, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. It immediately says about that in chapter 18, verse 9, that because of that, Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. What does Jonathan do? He just continues looking with love and admiration and respect for David. They're not singing about him at all. At least Saul's in the song. At least he's got a verse. Jonathan doesn't even get in the song. And he's the first one to take the battle to the Philistines. He's the one who gets the ball rolling. But it's fine with him that David gets the glory. Proverbs 18:24 says there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And that was Jonathan. I don't know about his relationship with his brothers, the 2 or the 3, but I know about David's relationship with his brothers. And I know about David's relationship with his sons that brought him so much grief. And what a joy and a blessing Jonathan must have been in his life. John chapter 3, verse 30 is where John the Baptist says when his disciples have come to him and they're bent out of shape because more people are now going to Jesus than are being baptized by him, or according to the beginning of John 4, more particularly being baptized by Jesus' disciples. But nonetheless, they're bent out of shape because more people are going to Jesus than are coming to John, and John says everything's working according to plan. He's the groom, I'm the best man. He must increase, I must decrease. As John the Baptist is to Jesus, so Jonathan is to David. As Barnabas was to Saul. It takes quite a man to step out of the limelight, to be an encourager, to help ensure someone else's success. Philippians 3 through 4, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interest of others. Romans 12:10, be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor. Somebody moved the clock hands on me, and it's a lot later than I was expecting it was going to be. I may just make you suffer through the rest of it. No, I'll be gracious. We'll summarize a little bit, but we've got to read this. Go with me to chapter 19, verses 1 through 5. 19, 1 through 5. Now Saul told Jonathan his son and all his servants to put David to death. But Jonathan, Saul's son, greatly delighted in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, Saul, my father, is seeking to put you to death. Now therefore, please be on your guard in the morning and stay in a secret place and hide yourself. I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak with my father about you. If I find out anything, then I will tell you. Then Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, do not let the king sin against his servant David, since he has not sinned against you, and since his deeds have been very beneficial to you. For he took his life in his hand and struck the Philistine, and the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by putting David to death without cause? Dad, if you kill him, you're sinning. You are sinning against God if you put this man to death. That takes some intestinal fortitude. That takes moral courage. That takes bravery to put your life on the line for the love of a friend. We know of Saul's twice trying to impale David with his spear, send assassins to his house, tries to impale Jonathan with his spear. Spear throwing for dummies may have been helpful to him as well. He doesn't seem to be very adept with his spear throwing. He tries to kill his own son. The beautiful parting of David and Jonathan because of the continued attempts on his life is recorded in verses 41 through 42 of chapter 20. When the lad was gone, David rose from the south side, fell on his face to the ground, and bowed 3 times. And they kissed each other and wept together. But David wept the more. Jonathan said to David, go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever. Then he rose and departed, while Jonathan went into the city. And while Saul is going to hunt David like an animal, Jonathan will finally track him down in the wilderness of Ziph in chapter 23. Verse 16 of 23 says, and Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David at Horish and encouraged him in the Lord, just like he had always done. He's a Barnabas before his time. Thus he said to him, do not be afraid, because the hand of my father Saul shall not find you, and you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. And Saul my father knows that also. It would have been a beautiful plan if Jonathan had survived, if he hadn't died along with 2 of his brothers, and still standing by the side of his father. As wrong as he was, as stubborn as he was, as wrong as he was, Jonathan stood by his father to the death. There's a beautiful tribute. We don't have time to read it in its entirety from 2 Samuel chapter 1 when David learns of the death of Saul and Jonathan. But I love one of the verses there as translated in the Message. Oh, my dear brother Jonathan, I'm crushed by your death. Your friendship was a miracle wonder, love far exceeding anything I've known or ever hope to know. Jonathan was that friend that stuck closer than a brother. Jonathan knew what it was like for people to put their lives on the line for you, to put their lives at risk for you. And He was willing to do that for David. We know what it's like for someone to have laid down their life for us. And as a result of that, we are called to lay down our lives for one another in love, in honor, in service. 1 John 3:16, we know love by this, that He laid down His life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. That's us. That's one another, brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ. John 15:13, Jesus said, greater love has no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends. Jonathan was willing to do that with David, but far greater than that was the love that Jesus had for us in allowing Himself to suffer and die as an innocent for the benefit of those of us who are guilty. Scott talked about reflecting on our baptism and what a joyful occasion that was. If you've lost the joy of that salvation and you want it restored, we would urge you to come to the Lord this morning. Come and let our shepherds pray with you and minister to you. If you need to experience that joy for the first time and be united with Christ for the forgiveness of your sins, we encourage you to do that while we stand and sing together.